ladies and gentlemen, at this point in time, I have the pleasure of turning it over to Defense Counsel, and they're going to call their first witness at this time. All right, Ms. Schneider?
Yes, Your Honor, we call Dr. Brian Peterson.
Okay, Dr. Peterson. Good morning, Doctor. Welcome. Watch your step, please.
Broken field running.
Yeah, you gotta be careful. All right, watch your step and have a seat on the witness stand. And just, let me just go ahead and have them sworn in. Just please raise your right hand for the question. First comes first.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Make yourself comfortable, sir.
Oh, yeah, we need to buy.
Too much stuff.
Do you need that, Ms. Schneider? You can pull it out. Do you need the easel at all? Otherwise,
Yes.
Harold can move wherever you need.
Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that's fine. As long as the jurors can see, it's fine.
Can everybody see? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, Dr. Peterson.
Good morning.
Dr. Peterson, would you please introduce yourself to the jury?
My name is Brian Peterson, Brian Peterson, criminal court, and I'm the chief medical examiner in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Now, I think you said that you're the medical examiner. Are you a medical doctor?
I am.
Do you specialize in anything in particular in medicine?
I specialize in pathology, anatomic pathology, and clinical pathology, and my subspecialty is forensic pathology.
Could you please tell the jury, Dr. Peterson, what is a forensic pathologist and medical examiner?
So, a medical examiner is an appointed person that is in charge of death investigation somewhere, as opposed to a coroner who's elected. So that's the big difference. A forensic pathologist, again, that's a medical subspecialty. So after a lot of training, a forensic pathologist can do autopsies in the medical legal setting that involves any kind of death. And by that I mean not just natural death, but also violent death. So as opposed to a hospital pathologist, it can only deal with natural death. So that's the big distinction there. But pretty much as a medical examiner, forensic pathologist, that's my job. So to do autopsies, go to court, testify, consultation, teaching, all those sorts of things.
Dr. Peterson, as a forensic pathologist and a medical examiner, are you here today to testify about whether Mr. Prideaux had primary lung cancer?
I am. I mean, that was the big question. We know Mr. Prideaux died of cancer, no question about that. In brief, my issue is I'm not sure what kind of cancer that was.
I'm just writing this up here to guide our discussion today. As a forensic pathologist and medical examiner, are you here today to testify about whether primary lung cancer caused Mr. Prideaux's death?
In a sense, I don't believe that he had primary lung cancer. So you might extend from that and say, I don't believe primary lung cancer caused his death. I have no doubt that he had cancer, okay? It's just a type of cancer.
Now, Dr. Peterson, did you review the medical records in this case?
I did.
Did you see that there are numerous references to lung cancer?
I did.
Did you see anywhere in the medical records, Dr. Peterson, where any of Mr. Prideaux's doctors called Mr. Prideaux's cancer a colon cancer?
No.
Did you see anywhere in the records where Mr. Prideaux's doctors called his cancer a prostate cancer?
No.
Are you the first doctor in the entire world to say this was colon or possibly prostate cancer?
Unless somebody else reviewed the case before I did. And there are times that can happen in hospitals.
Cystic.
Well, I'm not sure then. That certainly is my opinion, but if somebody else had it, I don't know.
Cystic. Cystic.
As far as you know, in the review of this case, you're the first person who said that this could possibly be prostate or colon cancer.
Yes.
Now, as a forensic pathologist and a medical examiner, is that something common that you do on a daily basis, where you actually evaluate a patient's clinical history, medical records, and come to a different diagnosis than the treating physicians?
Yes.
If all the medical records say lung cancer, then can we just go home?
Well, I would say no.
And why not?
I don't think he had primary lung cancer. We know the whole story. It didn't act like primary lung cancer. It acted much more like either prostate or colon.
And is that something that we're going to talk today about with the jury, about the things that you saw in medical records that led you to believe that this was more likely another type of cancer than lung cancer?
Yes.
Now we're going to talk more about this, but just to be clear for the jury, were cancer cells ever found in Mr. Perdeaux's lungs?
His lungs were never studied, so no.
Can you, I'm sorry, were you done?
No, that was done.
Can you prove cancer in the lung any way other than pathology showing cancer in the lung?
No.
As a medical examiner and forensic pathologist, does a big part of your job involve what you're going to do today and assess medical records and information to determine whether the treating physicians got it right or whether there's another explanation for a person's disease?
Yes.
System.
Well, are you here, Dr. Peterson, today to testify that all of Mr. Perdeaux's doctors were wrong when they called his cancer lung cancer?
System. System.
Did you come to a different conclusion than Mr. Perdeaux's treating physicians?
I did.
Are you here to criticize their treatment and care of Mr. Perdeaux?
No.
Were there things that now in hindsight Mr. Perdeaux's doctors could have done to establish the primary site and rule out other possibilities?
Yes.
Could they have gotten pathology from his lung?
Yes, they could have.
And would that have established whether or not Mr. Perdeaux had cancer in his lung?
It would.
Could they have done a colonoscopy?
They could have done that too.
And that would have either ruled out or ruled in colon cancer?
System.
Would that have either ruled out or ruled in colon cancer?
It would.
Could they have done an autopsy?
Yes.
And I know that's your favorite topic. And through an autopsy, could they have established the cause of Mr. Perdeaux's death?
That's certainly likely. I mean, we can't do that 100% with autopsy, but a lot of times we can.
Through an autopsy, could they have established the primary site of Mr. Perdeaux's cancer?
I think they likely could have.
Did Mr. Perdeaux had an oncologist named Dr. Armis, right?
He did.
And is Dr. Armis the doctor who actually diagnosed Mr. Perdeaux?
It depends on what you mean by diagnosed. I mean, to me, a diagnosis is pathological. So the pathologist that called the lung, or rather the bone biopsy, adenocarcinoma, that's the diagnosis. Everything else kind of flowed from there.
And that's a good point. Thank you, doctor. Is Dr. Armis the first medical doctor who called Mr. Perdeaux's cancer lung cancer?
He is.
Did Dr. Armis have more information when he called this lung cancer than you do now?
From my review of the record, no. Obviously, I wasn't there when it happened, but I have the same records.
Do you now have the benefit of hindsight and seeing the full picture of Mr. Perdeaux's clinical presentation throughout the course of his disease?
System.
Do you have all the information about Mr. Perdeaux's clinical course that Dr. Armis did not have at the beginning of his care and treatment?
That specifically is most true, that he made his conclusion about this being lung cancer at the beginning. And what I have, as opposed to that, is I know how Mr. Perdeaux ended up, where his disease progressed.
And is that something that you do in your daily practice as a forensic pathologist and medical examiner?
Well, sure, we always come at the end.
Dr. Peterson, do you understand that this is a tobacco case?
I do.
Are you here to testify today, Dr. Peterson, about smoking in any way, whether it be general or about Mr. Prideaux?
No.
Are you here to testify today about whether smoking caused Mr. Prideaux's cancer?
No.
Okay, so let's take a step back and have you give the jury some more information about your background and qualifications. How long have you been a doctor?
So, I graduated from medical school in 1980. After medical school, I did a clinical internship, rotating live patient care. I then spent 2 years with the Marines as a general medical officer. I went to the Naval Hospital in San Diego then for a residency in pathology. That was both anatomic and clinical. Anatomic is autopsy, but it's also surgical pathology, reading the biopsies, that sort of thing. Clinical pathology is the lab part. After those 4 years, I went to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C. That was my fellowship in forensic pathology. After all the training, I took 2 separate exams offered by the American Board of Pathology. They're the ones that credential us. First in anatomic and clinical, passed that. Second in forensic, passed that. Life was good. Went back to the Naval Hospital in San Diego, spent another 5 years on staff. Ultimately left the service. I was in a private practice in Northern California for about 13 years where we did hospital and forensic pathology. After all those years in California, got tired of it, moved to Wisconsin where I started. Spent a year at a small medical examiner's office, then went to Milwaukee, and I've been the chief there since 2010.
Over the course of your career, have you conducted autopsies?
I have.
How many autopsies have you conducted over the course of your career?
Just under 9,400.
So do you actually keep count?
I do.
You have a big tally board or something?
Little book.
Have you actually performed an autopsy on anyone that the jury may be familiar with?
In terms of name,
Oh, well, you can answer.
in terms,
Well, actually, you know what? No, never mind. Sustain. Sorry, I missed that. Sustain the objection.
All right. Well, as a pathologist and medical examiner, have you diagnosed cancer?
I have.
Have you diagnosed lung cancer?
I have.
Have you diagnosed cancer that spreads to the lung?
I have that too.
I want you to assume that the jury has heard the term unknown primary. Have you, over the course of your career, diagnosed cancer of unknown primary?
I have.
And over the course of your career, have you diagnosed these types of cancers in both living patients in the hospital setting as well as through autopsies?
Yes to both.
Now, I think you mentioned this, but just to be clear, are you licensed to practice medicine and board certified?
Both of those things. I'm licensed to practice medicine in California and Wisconsin, and I'm board certified anatomic, clinical, and forensic path.
How many board certifications do you hold?
2. I mean, the anatomic and clinical is a combined single certification, and then forensic is a separate one, so just those 2.
Now, is board certification done on a national basis, or is it done state by state?
Board certification is national. It's the same thing for anybody in the country, wherever. Licensing is state by state.
So when you went and took the board certification exam, you took the same exam as people practicing in Florida?
Correct.
Can you please tell the jury what you do on a daily basis as a medical examiner in Milwaukee?
So I wish more of my job were autopsies. That's still a big part of it. I do probably 250 a year is all. Aside from that, since I'm the chief, there's a lot of administrative overhead, meetings, that sort of thing. And then a lot of cases that go through my office don't actually get autopsies. We're reviewing the case for purposes of certifying the death. So I do about 90% of those myself. One of the other doctors helps out a little bit. Aside from that, we have a teaching program too. I mentioned I did a forensic fellowship. So for somebody after residency, they get an extra year of training to be a forensic pathologist. We train 1 year at my office. We also have our own toxicology lab, so I'm involved in the oversight of that as well. Those kind of administrative things.
Dr. Peterson, have you received any awards or had any special recognitions in your career?
I have. The latest fun thing that I got, one of the organizations I belong to is the National Association of Medical Examiners, so I got a service award from them for putting a meeting together back in 2013. A few other things too.
So let's shift course to talk about how you apply your medical expertise to legal cases. Now, is a forensic pathologist, by definition, someone who consults on legal cases?
For forensic pathology is right there in between medicine and law for sure. The difference is when you say legal cases, most of my legal cases are criminal cases. So most of the time when I go to court, I'm going to testify, say, in a homicide case. So for sure, this is a civil case, and that's really the minority of what I see.
How often do you go to court to testify in criminal cases?
That runs about 20 or 25 times a year on the average.
And is that part of your job duties as the medical examiner?
Yes.
Today you're testifying as a witness for the defense in a civil case. Have you also testified for plaintiffs in civil cases?
I have.
How many times total have you testified in court as an expert witness in both criminal and civil cases?
Over 600 times.
Prior to today, have you ever testified at trial in one of these types of cases, a tobacco case?
I have. This is my third one.
Have you ever given a deposition in a tobacco case like this?
I have.
How many times?
I'm thinking I've given a dozen or 15 or so depositions.
In all those cases, have you given the opinion that the person did not have lung cancer, or at least it was not clear if they had lung cancer?
The latter is true. Generally, what I'm expressing is reasonable uncertainty, that it's not clear that they had lung cancer. And those are, in all the cases where I've either testified or been deposed, that's been my opinion.
Now, have you actually reviewed some of these cases in addition to the ones that you've actually testified in?
I have.
And so has it occurred where there have been cases that have been sent to you and you said this is lung cancer?
Oh, sure.
Is that the case here?
No.
Now today is Monday. Dr. Peterson, do you typically work on Mondays?
I sure do.
Unfortunately, we all do. So because you're away from your job today, are you charging for your time?
I am.
And do you charge a fee to review and testify in legal cases?
I do.
What are your fees?
Well, it depends on the case. So for the criminal work that I do as part of my job in Milwaukee, the homicides and so forth, we don't get paid for those. So that's just part of the job. If I'm reviewing a case for the office, maybe I'm testifying for the defense someplace in Wisconsin, but it's not an autopsy that I did. The county gets paid. I don't get paid. All right, so for a case like this, I do get paid. My fee is $500 an hour, and that's for whatever I do, whether it's reviewing the case, traveling, testifying in court, being deposed, just a flat fee.
How much have you charged for your work on this case so far?
Shoot. I wasn't sure you were going to ask. I think somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 to date.
And is that for your time that you've actually spent reviewing the medical records and giving your deposition?
It's been deposition, review, meetings, all the things involved in looking at the case.
As part of your review, I think you mentioned that you reviewed the medical records.
I did.
How many pages of medical records do we have in this case?
There were maybe 80 or 100 pages. There were other pages that didn't help me much. Mostly records to say there were no records. But in terms of the actual meat, maybe 80 or 100 pages.
And in your experience as a medical examiner who, as part of your job, you review cases like this, is it likely that we have all of the records that were ever created for Mr. Perdot?
No, not at all. In fact, I'm sure we don't.
As far as you know, have you reviewed all the medical records that we have available in this case?
Yes.
I want to talk to you a little bit about pathology, since you are a pathologist. The jury has heard some about these general concepts, so I'm not going to spend too much time. But briefly, doctor, what is cancer?
Cancer is an uncontrolled growth of cells, really. And the cells tend to a greater or lesser degree look abnormal, but they certainly do act abnormal. And it's the uncontrolled growth that makes it malignant or cancer.
And we've talked about primary lung cancer. What is primary lung cancer?
So that term means a cancer that actually originates in the lung. So it's kind of lung tissue gone bad produces the cancer. That's where it started.
So even if someone has cancer in their lungs, can you call that primary lung cancer?
Not without knowing more than just that. I mean, just having a mass in the lung, the most common mass in the lung, if it's malignant, is metastatic, not primary.
And can you explain that, doctor?
Well, so when cancer spreads from one place to another, that's metastasis. So you can have something malignant growing in a lung that started there. If it did, it's primary. If it started someplace else, it's metastatic, and that's the difference. So, that's looking at statistics then, saying the most common mass is going to be metastatic. I always like to point out, though, that statistics don't apply to the patient that I'm looking at because they have what they have, no matter what populations get.
Why is it that most commonly tumors in the lung are metastases?
It's just a favorable place for implants to grow. We know the lung has awesome circulation. I mean, the capillary bed is huge. There are more places for malignant cells that are traveling through the vascular system to get stuck, I think. There are probably other sort of microclimate things in the lung, the oxygen and so forth, that makes it more favorable for cancer cells to grow. Probably a combination of those things.
Can metastatic cancer show up in the lung as a single tumor?
Oh, sure. I mean, pathologists say cancer can do what it wants to. So you tend to think that buckshot look, multiple deposits, says metastatic, and a single thing says primary, but it's not always that way. Cancer can do what it wants.
So would the rule of thumb be then, when you're first looking at a case, that if you see a single tumor in the lung, it's more likely to be a primary? Cystine. What is your rule of thumb when you see a case that has a single tumor in the lung?
If all I know up front is that there's a single thing in the lung, and I know it's malignant, I would tend to think primary.
Do you then assess the entire clinical picture to determine whether that's actually consistent with a primary versus a metastasis?
Well, I would hope. I mean, as a pathologist, I work with what I'm given, so they're going to send me tissue to examine, and that's how I make a diagnosis, unless it's an autopsy, but that's the general progression then.
So here, let me back up. Are there what's called cell types of cancer?
There are.
And what is a cell type?
Well, we talked about cell of origin a little bit ago. So just to say cancer means malignant. But there are different kinds of cancer, and it depends on the cell they come from. If they're from a so-called epithelial cell, think major organ, skin, etc., that would be a carcinoma. If they're from blood-forming cells, that would be leukemia, lymphoma. And if they're from deeper soft tissue, think muscle, bone, etc., that's a sarcoma. So they're all malignant. They can all be called cancer, but only the one type is actually a carcinoma.
Now, is it a pathologist who actually determines the cell type?
Oh, sure.
How do pathologists determine the cell type of the cancer?
First and foremost is microscopic study. So if we're looking at individual cells, that's cytology, like a pap smear. If we're looking at a biopsy or something, that's histology, just bigger. So that's the start, and there are certain basic tissue stains that we use. After that, there are fancier stains that we can use, immune-based stains that maybe identify certain antigens. All right, so for example, the prostate gland. The cells there can make a chemical called prostate-specific antigen. So if you find prostate-specific antigen in malignant cells, you might think that started in prostate, as an example. There are other things that we can do with other kinds of malignancy, other laboratory studies, especially for the leukemias.
Now, I want you to assume that the jury's heard that this PSA stain is 95% accurate for detecting whether someone has prostate cancer or not. Do you agree?
No, you got to be careful with that term accurate. All right, so what we as pathologists know is that 95% of primary prostate cancers make prostate-specific antigen. 5% don't. So you can have an adenocarcinoma that originates in the prostate that doesn't make prostate-specific antigen. The problem when you say accurate, that can have to do with accuracy of testing, false positives, false negatives, that sort of thing. But assuming the testing is accurate, result, either a true positive or true negative, then 5% of the time it will be negative because some prostate cancers just don't make PSA.
Does a negative PSA rule out prostate cancer?
It doesn't, and the reason is, as I just mentioned, you can have false negatives and true negatives, okay? If a negative really is negative, all it means is that cell doesn't happen to make PSA, like 5% of prostate cancers don't. If it's a false negative, then it really doesn't help you. You have to do other testing or repeat testing to find out what the case is.
How do the questions that you look at as a forensic pathologist differ from the questions that a treating doctor would look at?
My view is different, all right? So in the first place, I don't have any time urgency as a forensic pathologist. Patients already passed away, and yet they're still my patient. So I have an opportunity to ask different questions in a case like this, looking for perhaps other potential primary sources for the cancer. And I can approach that in different ways that you obviously can never do with a living patient, namely the autopsy. So I can look at a lot more tissue types, and I can look at a lot more of each tissue than you could possibly do in a living.
How many forensic pathologists are there in the country?
There are about 500 working. There are a few more than that, but people that have retired and so forth. About 500 of us on the job.
How does that compare to the number of pathologists, clinical pathologists, or anatomical pathologists in the country?
I can't give you a total number for them, but I know that we're way outnumbered. Way outnumbered.
Other than forensic pathology, is there any other medical specialty that focuses their training on investigating and determining cause of death?
No.
As a forensic pathologist and medical examiner, do you regularly complete death certificates?
Every day. Well, not today, but almost every other day.
Over the course of your career, how many times have you determined an individual's cause of death?
Well, every autopsy I've done, so around 9,400, every autopsy I've supervised for my trainees, and then all the cases I reviewed that haven't required autopsy, I mean tens of thousands.
What tools do forensic pathologists use to determine the cause of death in an individual?
Well, autopsy is a big tool. It's our favorite tool, and when it comes to determining specifically the cause of death, it's really the only tool. Aside from that, like other doctors, we'll review other tests, work that other pathologists have done, looking at tissue, like in this case, the medical record, to what we can get from there, but the only specific tool we have is the autopsy.
And you did mention other ways to determine the cause of death. So in your practice, do you determine the cause of death in people without an autopsy?
I do.
How often have you had to determine the cause of death in a patient without being able to perform an autopsy?
Year by year, that's actually more than the cases where I do an autopsy. So if I'm doing maybe 250 autopsies a year, I'm determining cause of death and issuing a death certificate in probably a couple or 3,000.
What do you do in a case like this where we don't have an autopsy?
Well, I use what I can get. I mean, we have medical records here, and that's pretty much what you use what you have, and that's about it.
As a forensic pathologist and medical examiner, how would you compare your perspective to that of a doctor who is treating an individual during an illness?
My perspective is more holistic and it's more long-term. I can look at the whole case from beginning to end. And what I see is that a lot of times an assessment will be made early on, but as the course of the disease progresses, things now look different. But everybody stays with what they had. That's just kind of what people do. So I'm not hampered by that. So I can look at the whole case from beginning to end and kind of see how it turned out, and that gives me a perspective that a treating physician couldn't have.
Have you, in your career, looked at cases without autopsies and come to the conclusion that the person had and died from primary lung cancer?
Sure.
Have you ever certified someone's cause of death as lung cancer, primary lung cancer, when you haven't had pathology from the lung?
No.
to this case? What were you asked to do in this case?
I was asked to review the available records. There was also a couple depositions to review, and the question that was posed to me was, what do you think Mr. Prideaux had? Really nothing more than that.
Through your review of the medical records, are there important medical records that are missing in this case?
There are.
Based on the quantity and quality of the materials you reviewed, is it possible to say, as a forensic pathologist and a medical examiner, where Mr. Prideaux's cancer started?
No, I can give a list of differential diagnoses, but I can't say specifically.
And could you please explain to the jury why that is?
Well, there were certain studies, to make a diagnosis of primary lung cancer that simply weren't done for Mr. Prideaux. He never had a lung biopsy, as an example. The other couple diagnoses that I think are more likely, namely prostate and colon, the prostate was never biopsied and he never had a colonoscopy, so there simply weren't those procedures done that may have cleared the answer up one way or another.
Based on the information available to you in this case, and your expertise as a forensic pathologist and medical examiner, did you come to an opinion as to whether Mr. Prideaux had a primary lung cancer?
I did.
What is that opinion?
My opinion is that he didn't.
Sure.
Sustain to the last question and answer. Please disregard the last question and answer. You may proceed, Ms. Schneider. Thank you.
Dr. Peterson, is it your opinion to a reason?
Sustain.
Do you have an opinion as to a reasonable degree of medical probability whether there's enough information in this case to say Mr. Prideaux had primary lung cancer?
I do.
And so when you say, when you're giving your opinion as to whether Mr. Prideaux had primary lung cancer, is your opinion in this case, well, let me back up. Do you have an opinion as to whether or not Mr. Prideaux had cancer of unknown primary?
I do.
And what is that opinion?
My opinion is that cancer of unknown primary would be a perfectly logical diagnosis in his case.
And please explain that.
I mentioned earlier specific studies weren't done. Okay, lung biopsy not done, prostate not done, colonoscopy not done. So I think with so many things not done, all that we can say confidently is that he had adenocarcinoma. That was established by the biopsy. And given that he had metastatic adenocarcinoma, and we're not sure where it started, then carcinoma of unknown primary is a logical diagnosis.
So, Dr. Peterson, what is your opinion then as to whether there is enough information to say Mr. Prideaux had primary lung cancer?
My opinion is that there's not enough information to say that he had primary lung cancer.
Now, do we have enough information to exclude lung cancer as a possibility?
No.
What do you have an opinion as to whether there are more likely possibilities than lung cancer?
I do.
And are we going to go through those today?
I hope so.
And I just noticed that. I think so. Blood pressure, I guess. Whoops. types of cancers that can go to the lungs?
Yes,
Can pancreatic cancer spread to the lungs?
it can.
Can prostate cancer spread to the lungs?
Yes,
Can cancer of the GI tract spread to the lungs?
yes,
Can colon cancer spread to the lungs?
yes,
Can liver cancer spread to the lungs?
yes,
Can skin cancer spread to the lungs?
yes.
Have you seen cancer of unknown primary in your practice?
I have.
Have you actually certified people's death as cancer of unknown primary?
I have.
And how often does that occur where you certify someone's death as cancer of unknown primary?
I would say uncommonly. I know I've done it, but it's not the most common diagnosis.
And does that have to do with the fact that you're conducting an autopsy to actually find the primary site?
Sustained.
What is the reason that you have not certified many deaths as cancer from unknown primary?
The main reason is selection bias. Okay, so the cases that come to my office pretty much come by state statute. And most of the time, when somebody has metastatic cancer of whatever kind, they're going to have treating physicians that are going to sign their death certificate, so it never even comes to me. So it's simply case selection.
Are you familiar with the percentage of cancers in 1996 that were cancers of unknown primary?
I can't give you a percent, no.
You talked before about stains that can be actually used to help determine the primary site. Were stains done in this case on the pathology that Mr. Prideaux had?
There were a couple different special stains done on the original bone biopsy. There was a PSA stain done, and there was another one called CEA, carcinoma embryonic antigen. CEA by itself isn't really site-specific, but pathologists tend to think colon. PSA, as we know, is relatively site-specific if the prostate cancer makes it, which 95% do, 5% don't.
The staining that was done in this case, does that tell us where Mr. Prideaux's cancer started?
No.
I want you to assume that the jury has heard that there have been radiology studies done on Mr. Prideaux called X-rays and CT scans. Briefly, can you please describe to the jury what CT scans and X-rays show?
They both use radiation. X-rays are simply kind of a one-pass view. X-rays go through, hit the film or the sensor. A CT scan is the patient goes into a gantry and you have a series of X-ray emitters and collectors. So in a way, you're kind of reconstructing what could even be a 3D slice of the patient. They're both looking for abnormalities. The main difference is that a CT scanner has higher resolution and can sometimes see areas that it's harder to get to with plain X-ray.
If a doctor sees something on an X-ray or CT scan, like a mass, does that mean that they have, and it's in their lungs, does that mean that they have primary lung cancer?
Sustained.
When a doctor sees a mass in a person's lung on an X-ray or CT scan, can you diagnose that person with primary lung cancer?
No.
Did Mr. Prideaux have X-rays, CT scans, and other radiology done throughout the course of his care and treatment?
He did X-rays, CTs, and then nuclear resonance scans, MRIs also.
Do we have those films available to us?
No.
Do you typically read films in your practice?
Not films anymore. We actually have digital X-ray at the office, so we take them and then I analyze those images. It's not like the old TV films anymore, but I'm still looking at X-rays.
Well, if we had films in this case, is that something that you would have reviewed in your assessment of whether Mr. Prideaux had primary lung cancer?
Sure.
And what can you see by looking at the film that you can't otherwise know just from either the report or a second or third hand report of what was shown on the chest X-ray or a CT scan?
Well, radiology is just like pathology. You know, we always joke that if you have two pathologists in a room, you have three opinions. So radiology is kind of like that. So if I'm looking at a second or a third-hand opinion of a radiology study, whatever kind of film it is, all I have is that one opinion. It may be that if I look at the film, or if another radiologist looked at the film, the opinion will be different. We can't know since we don't have it.
Listen to speak.
In your practice and career, is it common for people reviewing radiology films to reach different conclusions about what they see?
Oh, sure. Is that like pathologists? Same idea.
So when pathologists or other doctors look at tissue under the microscope, is it also common for them to disagree as to what they see?
It is.
Sustain.
In cases where you are trying to determine the primary site, are radiology films important in your assessment?
They can be helpful, but they aren't tissue. I'm a pathologist. I want to see tissue. For me, they're more helpful to tell me maybe where there are other lesions that could be approached by a biopsy, but they're not going to tell me where the primary is.
But in a case where your opinion is based on the fact that we don't have enough information, would looking at the actual radiology films give you more information than you have?
Sustain as the leading. You can, why don't you rephrase it? Schneider, thank you.
Do you get more information when you're looking at radiology films?
I get more information looking at a film than looking at a report.
Now, you've mentioned radiology reports. Do we have any of those in this case?
No, just references to them.
Can you diagnose cancer based on radiology?
No.
What do you need in order to diagnose cancer?
Tissue. You have to have tissue, and whether it's pieces of tissue or cells, cytology or histology, that's what you have to have.
All right, so now I want to talk about autopsies, which is something that you do every day. I think we have a board. Now, Dr. Pearson, it would be helpful for you to get down off the witness stand and come with this board to explain to the jury what you do when you're doing autopsies on patients. Can you get by there?
Just watch your step back.
I fit over here.
And I did put a pointer up there if you need that, or if you're just going to use your finger, whatever you want to do. It's not, you see it on the other side? Oh, no. Oh.
Just like leaving on.
That's perfectly fine, as long as the jury can see.
Okay.
Dr. Peterson, can you please explain what you do in your general practice when you're doing autopsies?
So once we get to the actual physical part of the autopsy, as opposed to the record review and so forth, we do an external exam first. So we'll look at the body just as received. In a lot of our cases, I can look at clothing, evidence of medical therapy, etc. Once we remove those things and we have a new body, sometimes we have to clean it. Now we do another external exam, and what we're looking for is injury, old injury, scars, marks, tattoos, that sort of thing. Once it comes time to do the internal exam, pretty much we do the same thing in each case if the whole body's there. I mean, sometimes it isn't. We do make a Y-shaped incision on the torso and extend it down to the pubis. Reflect the soft tissue back, remove the front of the chest, the ribs, and now we've exposed all these colorful things inside, lungs, heart, liver, spleens over there, colon, small bowel, kidneys behind, and remove those normally one at a time. It depends a little bit on the case. Sometimes we can take the whole block out. It all depends on what we're looking for. So that's inside the torso. So we're looking for organ pathology, injury, recovery of evidence, bullets, collecting specimens for toxicology, drug alcohol testing, etc. The last actual physical thing that we do in a normal autopsy is to reflect the scalp up there, forward and back, exposing the top of the skull. We remove that with a saw, remove the brain. That's all for a normal autopsy. We can do extra things depending. Remove the spinal cord, for example. We do some other studies. More dissection of the back and the neck sometimes, depending on the injury we're looking for. But the routine is the Y-shaped incision and the scalp incision, examining everything in the chest, the abdomen, and the head.
Okay, well, you can take a seat if you'd like. I'm sure I'll ask you to get up again in a few minutes.
It's a good stretch.
Oh,
Maybe we might want to move that.
Yeah.
since you talked about the big Schneider.
Dr. Peterson, have you ever performed an autopsy on someone who came to you with a diagnosis of lung cancer that you determined after doing an autopsy it was something different?
Oh, sure.
How can you tell the primary site when you do an autopsy?
Some primary sites look different, is probably the easiest way to put that. So take, for example, colon cancer, all right? Colon cancer is oftentimes started out either from a flat, it's called a sessile polyp in the...
I don't know what that was.
I don't know. In the colon, or a raised polyp. Those are the two different ways that they can present. And there's a certain gross appearance, and then you can study those things microscopically. So that will tell you if that, in fact, is a primary colon cancer. And as they progress, the way they grow through the wall and so forth, that's all there for gross examination. In the prostate gland, you know, there are portions of the prostate gland that can't be reached with the finger. So we take the whole thing out from the inside and section it. And you can find cancers that are farther in that you couldn't see clinically. And the tissue looks different, and then microscopically it's different. In the pancreas, for example, all right, there's a look to a primary pancreatic cancer, wherever that's growing in the head or the tail, that we can see as we section the whole organ like you could never do clinically. So it's really a matter of carefully examining the tissue, and we're looking for both gross features, that just means naked eye, and then microscopic features, that's how we tell.
I want you to assume that the jury has heard that Mr. Prideaux's cancer is most likely lung cancer because of the organs in which it appeared, as well as the order of metastases. When you're conducting autopsy like you just discussed, do you consider the order in which cancer appears on radiology when coming to your decision about the primary site?
The radiologic order isn't necessarily helpful to me because that can say as much about the limits of detection on X-ray as anything else. And always remember, X-rays, they're looking at shadows, and because there happens to be a shadow there, you don't know what that is until you study the tissue. That's why I like being a pathologist. So neither the order nor the appearance on X-ray necessarily informs me beyond what I would find at autopsy.
In other words, just because you can't see something on radiology, is it your opinion that that doesn't mean it's not there?
Sustained.
Please explain, Dr. Peterson, what it means if something's not there on radiology as to whether it could exist.
There are a couple reasons why it's hard to see things on X-ray versus seeing it live. Well, maybe live is the wrong word, but at autopsy. One of them is that you have to have a certain size to show up on X-ray. Back at this time, the magic number was 0.5 centimeter, 1/4 inch. So anything smaller than that, even on CT scan, you weren't going to see. Sometimes the way cancer spreads, you're just not going to see it on X-ray at all. So in this case, where we had abdominal or peritoneal carcinomatosis as it's spreading in the abdominal cavity, that's on the surfaces of bowel. You really can't see that with X-ray. There's just, the bowel wall is a certain thickness, and you can't necessarily even appreciate that with even a CT scan these days. So you have to get in there and look yourself, and that's why autopsies are so great.